We are going to continue on with some fantastic presentations this afternoon, starting with Alice Xiang, who's now the global head of AI ethics at Sony. And I have the pleasure of working with her at Sony AI, where she leads a group of researchers on the AI ethics team there. Before Sony AI, Alice was at Partnership on AI. And she's been very well honored within academia. Her career is now in industry, but she has a law degree from Yale and developmental economics master's degree from Oxford, and 2 degrees from Harvard, a bachelor in economics and a master's in statistics. So quite an eclectic background. And recently, was named by Nature as one of the 10 scientists to watch in 2026. So I think we will honor that by watching her give this next talk.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction, Peter. And it's really such a pleasure and honor to be with all of you today and to have the opportunity to present on FHIBE, which is the Fair Human-centric Image BEnchmark. This project is the culmination of many years of work by my team, the AI Ethics Lab in Sony AI, and wouldn't have been possible without the strong executive support of Peter Stone as well. And so we're super excited that now it's been published in Nature, and I have the opportunity to chat with all of you about it today. So before we get into the details of FHIBE, let's first just talk a bit about what motivated this project. So one common theme, I think, throughout today is that the future of AI, and indeed to some extent the present of AI, is really human-centric. So AI technologies are increasingly embedded in human systems, directly interacting with people, making important decisions for people, doing a lot of the work that has historically been considered fundamentally human. But with this increasing capability from AI technology comes as well additional ethical responsibilities and considerations. So the focus of the FHIBE project was really on human-centric computer vision technologies. And I define that here as computer vision systems that rely on images of humans for training and or testing. So this includes for tasks like pose estimation, face body detection, facial verification, recognition, and image generation. And this is a very important area for AI ethics because human images are a highly sensitive data source. It includes biometric information, personally identifiable information, and a lot of information about the broader context around people as well. And so when we think about the ethical issues associated with data curation, human-centric computer vision is one of the most sensitive areas. And not only is this a valuable area to study in terms of the tricky aspects of the data itself, but also in terms of the downstream implications of any biases in human-centric computer vision technologies. And so this includes, for example, performance differences between people with lighter and darker skin tones, potentially leading to higher rates of wrongful arrest for those with darker skin tones. Studies have also found that in the autonomous vehicle context that these models don't necessarily perform as well for children and people with darker skin tones. So that's another very high risk, life or death kind of scenario. But this is also true of more everyday contexts as well. So using your face to unlock your phone or do financial transactions. If there are these differences in performance, this can not only impact your convenience and your enjoyment of the products and services that you've paid for, but also potentially create equity issues there as well. So despite the fact that this is such an important area of consideration and data plays a very huge aspect of the biases that we see, we see that there's not necessarily been as much consideration of how to properly curate data in this space. And this is something that is important because all of the different ethical properties of AI models start at the data layer. Just as parents can shape their children's worldviews through what information and experiences they're exposed to, AI developers can also mold their AI systems through data curation. So for example, when we talk about bias, a lot has been made of the fact that major academic image data sets are sourced primarily from a few developed countries. And this has had downstream implications such as object recognition models performing more poorly on images from lower income countries, and also AI systems suffering from an own race bias in recognition. So similar to humans, those developed in a Western context tend to work better in that context versus those developed in an Eastern context, for example. Data curation, however, in the space of human-centric computer vision has historically been undervalued compared to algorithmic advances. So in the early days, a lot of the data curation was highly bespoke and very small and constrained data sets. This, though, limited the performance of the AI systems that were developed using these data sets. And so ImageNet was really revolutionary, not only for computer vision, but also for ushering in the deep learning revolution by creating this huge data set that could then advance the development of AI technologies and capabilities. Nowadays, in the era of generative and agentic AI technologies, we further see these concerns about ethical data collection practices taking front stage. So when we think about these issues of mass surveillance, for example, that connects directly to data privacy rights that individuals hold. And if we think about the future of work and the potential for AI to displace creators, a lot of those debates are precisely about intellectual property in data and to what extent those are respected when data is used for AI development. And if we look at historical data collection strategies in the space, they have been insufficient from an ethical perspective. So web scraping has become the dominant form of data collection in many areas of AI, including human-centric computer vision. This has led to these significant gains in performance, but not necessarily in terms of the ethical properties of these models. And indeed, even data sets that have been collected specifically for ethical purposes, so those collected for fairness evaluation, for example, have come under scrutiny for their web-scraped properties. So despite the fact that it's been years now that folks have been discussing these challenges in terms of ethical data curation, computer vision researchers by and large don't see a great alternative to using these ethically problematic data sets. And from my own experience as well, looking at the industry context, working with a lot of folks, both at Sony nowadays and also back when I was at the Partnership on AI with industry more broadly, the options that practitioners have when it comes to trying to evaluate model bias in human-centric computer vision are quite limited. So for example, you could use diverse and densely annotated public data sets that carry legal or ethical risks. If you're doing this in a company context, there's a strong probability that your legal or privacy team will raise some flags and you might just not be able to proceed with this. And even if they don't, you should be very careful about the use of those data sets. You can use one of the very few publicly available consent-based data sets, but these are highly limited. So these, by and large, either are very small data sets or don't contain pixel-level annotations or aren't sufficiently diverse. You can develop your own proprietary data set to check your model, but this has issues both of being very expensive and also not providing transparency to external parties, which if your goal is to audit your system for bias and publicize any of that information, then it's challenging if you're just using a proprietary data set that nobody else has access to. You can also use data sets that have been quietly retracted due to ethical concerns, but still circulate in derivative forms. This sounds like something no one should be doing, but actually is very common, especially in academia. So, data sets keep getting cited even if the original form has been retracted. And so at the end of the day, what is often one of the most common practices is people don't check for bias because it's too challenging in terms of this legal ethical quagmire in order to do anything about this. And if there's not a requirement to check for bias, then why do that? So that leads us to FHIBE. So FHIBE is the first publicly available, globally diverse, consensually collected fairness evaluation data set for a wide variety of human-centric computer vision tasks. So FHIBE is really designed to fill that gap that the previous slide discussed. And as Peter kindly mentioned, FHIBE was recently published in Nature. We were featured on the cover of Nature and also in an editorial that was talking about the importance of ethical data collection in AI and sort of a call for action for more people to work in this space. And FHIBE is unique because it was made for ethics and built with ethics. So it was made specifically for the purpose of helping researchers and developers diagnose bias in AI models. And it can be applied to a wide variety of different human-centric computer vision tasks and has the annotations, ground truth annotations to facilitate that. It also has richer annotations than any previously existing publicly available consensual computer vision fairness data set, meaning that you can make more granular and accurate bias diagnoses. In addition, FHIBE is not just an artifact in itself, it's also how it was developed and the best practices that were instantiated there. And so a major part of what is unique about FHIBE is that it was ethically sourced and curated. It's the first public human-centric computer vision data set that was designed to be GDPR compliant, and it's and informed consent and fair compensation were heavily emphasized throughout the design process, with consent being something that can be withdrawn by data subjects at any point in time. So now to go into what exactly is FHIBE and what FHIBE contains. So FHIBE comprises over 10,000 images of nearly 2,000 unique subjects from over 80 countries and areas, and also includes a wide variety of annotations. So we have image subject annotations, which include also self-reported annotations for sensitive attributes such as age, ancestry, and gender pronouns. That's important since a lot of existing data sets either lack those annotations or have third-party annotations that are just guesses of people's annotations instead of their own self-reported demographics. FHIBE also contains instrument annotations, so information, for example, about capture speed, camera shutter speed, things like that, and also environmental annotations, such as around the scene and lighting. And this can be important for not only bias detection, but also trying to figure out what some of the underlying causes of some of the correlations that you might be seeing are. In addition, FHIBE consists of face and person bounding boxes, segmentation masks, and key points, and so that enables it to be used for a wider variety of tasks. Images feature both primary and secondary subjects. This was something that was really important to us since a lot of consensual data sets only have just images of someone's face, but we wanted to have a wider variety of diversity in this data set. So we wanted images that include two people as well, so you can have a wider variety of interactions shown, and also full body images, so you can have that diversity in pose. There's over 1,234 intersectional groups that are featured in FHIBE as defined by the age group, pronoun, ancestry subregion, and Fitzpatrick skin tone. And then we also include some derivative data sets, including a downsampled version and a couple face derivatives as well. An important part of FHIBE was prioritizing diversity because this was designed to be a fairness evaluation data set. And so we had carefully designed diversity specifications along a wide variety of different dimensions. So you can see on the left-hand side just the huge amount of diversity that's captured across all of these dimensions. And then in terms of some of the more sensitive attributes, we have pretty good balance across skin tone, for example. For ancestry, we have overrepresented some of the more commonly underrepresented regions, and then we have quite a bit of diversity as well for age and for gender pronouns. So comparing FHIBE to existing data sets, so if we look at existing data sets that have been used in computer vision for fairness purposes, the vast majority of them were scraped from internet platforms or derived from scraped data sets. And 6 out of the nearly 30 that we looked at were revoked by their authors and are no longer publicly available, most likely due to legal or ethical concerns, though some of them still have derivative versions floating around. And many of them also lack the density in terms of pixel-level annotations or in terms of demographic attributes. And by definition, any of the ones that are web-scraped don't have the ground truth or the self-reported demographic annotations. And then the few that did have any form of consent either were very small data sets or had very limited or problematic consent strategies or lacked relevant annotations such that they weren't able to be used for a wide variety of different computer vision tasks. So comparing FHIBE to this field, we see that FHIBE is the only data set with robust consent for and developed for AI evaluation and bias mitigation purposes. In addition, comparing FHIBE to other data sets, including web-scraped and consensual data sets, FHIBE stands out in terms of the detailed and self-reported demographic labels that we have. So this allows a much more granular form of intersectional bias diagnosis. So you can look at bias, for example, along gender, age, ancestry, skin tone, and then a wide variety of other attributes as well. And indeed, when we look at the attribute values that FHIBE has compared to other data sets, even the web-scraped ones, FHIBE has far more density in terms of attribute values. FHIBE also has greater representation from regions that have historically been underrepresented in many computer vision data sets, such as Africa and lower middle-income economies. So now that we've kind of gone over what FHIBE is, let's talk a little bit about the ethical principles that underlied FHIBE's design. So our goal with FHIBE at the end of the day was to raise the ethical standard in AI, not only provide a data set, but also show that it's possible to collect data in a more ethical way to hopefully inspire others to do the same. And so as part of that, it was very important for us in this data collection process to implement the ethical best practices that have been posited, but by and large not operationalized. So some of the core principles that we focused on included consent, privacy and intellectual property, fair compensation, safety, and diversity. So I'll talk about each of these in turn. So first of all, in terms of consent, we spent a lot of time focused on consent processes. So as I mentioned, looking at GDPR, but also other strict data privacy, data protection laws around the world to try to gain inspiration for our consent process. And it was really important to us that we very clearly inform data subjects of any possible risks prior to them participating, and then also that they be allowed to revoke consent at any point in time. And that's not only during the data collection process, but also ongoing. So FHIBE is meant to evolve over time if there are any consent revocations as well. In addition, we took other steps around protecting data rights holders. So for one, we removed any non-consensual subjects, such as small people in the background that might have incidentally been featured in the images, or personally identifiable information such as license plates. And this is important since, again, images are so rich in terms of the types of privacy in terms of the types of private information that they might disclose, and so we wanted to go above and beyond in terms of how we address that. Not only did we take automated processes in terms of identifying those forms of information and inputting them, but we also took manual checks as well to ensure that everything was done appropriately, and we sufficiently balanced privacy preservation with the utility of the images for downstream tasks. In addition, we looked carefully at intellectual property, making sure that the subjects provided the necessary rights for these images to be used for downstream purposes, and also that we removed prominent logos or other types of third-party intellectual property from the images as much as possible. Compensation was also another key feature of our process, since there's been many reports about the data supply chain in AI consisting of very problematic labor practices. And so we worked closely with our data vendors to ensure that image subjects, annotators, quality assurance annotators were all paid at least their local minimum wage based on the amount of time it took to complete the tasks. And we also requested from them payment reports so that we could be able to check this and validate this as well. And based on these reports, participants were paid on average around 12 times their local minimum wage. Safety was also another important consideration. We wanted to make sure that people did not have to worry about being exposed to violent, illegal, or harmful content with the use of this data set. And so we took a combination of both automated and manual review steps in order to ensure that problematic materials were not included in this data set. And we also thought very carefully about the private information that subjects would be disclosing, since this was always intended to be a publicly available data set. And so, for example, part of why we chose to use pronouns instead of either asking for gender or sex is because we wanted to choose something that provided some similar amount of information that would be useful for bias diagnosis, but would be more kind of the external facing, publicly facing information rather than something that might disclose more private information about the individual. Diversity, as I already mentioned, was also a very important element of this, and so we prioritized intersectional dimensions such as the demographics, the phenotypic attributes, and the pose of the subjects in terms of maximizing diversity in the data set. We also respected the individual's self-identification, so that's why we asked for self-reported annotations instead of having third parties annotate them. And then we sought to source the data from as many geographies as possible, which proved to also make this a very operationally difficult task, but something that was quite important for this project. Overall, the goal with FHIBE is that it is a living data set, and so as participants withdraw consent, we also commit to replacing the withdrawn images as much as possible to preserve diversity and utility in the data set. And this is something that's also very unique about FHIBE. It's designed to be a living data set that will evolve responsibly over time. So now that we've talked a bit about FHIBE and its design, it's worth talking about the different types of bias diagnoses that we were able to do with FHIBE. So FHIBE enables fairness benchmarking across a wide variety of different human-centric and face-centric tasks. And so for each of these tasks, we took a bunch of the commonly used models and also commonly used data sets and compared FHIBE with them. And we were able to identify different model disparities across a wide variety of attributes given the richness of annotations in FHIBE. So we have a lot of these diagnoses we did where we basically intersected a bunch of different groups, took the statistically significant results, and then compared to see what are some of the groups that had the larger disparities versus smaller disparities across different types of tasks. And some very general trends that we noted were that models tended to perform best for younger individuals, those with lighter skin tones, and those with Asian ancestry, and worst for those who were older individuals, those with darker skin tones, and those with African ancestry. One caveat, though, with this is we also saw significant variability in terms of the performance based on particular models and tasks, and so it's very important to test intersectional biases on a case-by-case basis instead of just assuming that your model performs better for certain groups or worse for other groups based on these general trends. We also saw that intersecting the groups led to more significant disparities as well, and so this was also very important since historically there hasn't been as much focus on intersectional biases, in part due to lack of data availability, but also increased complexity and difficulty in terms of interpreting intersectional results. But what we found was that it is quite important to think about these different intersectional dimensions and also not to just consider these dimensions as being proxies for each other. So for example, if you add skin tone on top of ancestry, you can surface more biases than if you just look at those separately. And that was an interesting insight since often in the context of lack of demographic information, it's common to use these demographics as proxies for each other, especially around ancestry and skin tone. We also found some other interesting biases, such as, for example, for face verification models, differences in hairstyles led to performance drops, and also individuals who had non-stereotypical hairstyles. So, for example, people with he, him pronouns that had longer hairstyles tended to have lower performance rates for face verification models. So this is an example of how having those phenotypic attributes annotated as well could be useful for diagnosing what are some of the failure modes. In addition to looking at bias for these discrete human-centric computer vision tasks, we also looked at biases in foundation models. And one example of this was we asked some foundation models for reasons for why an individual is likable based on just their image. And we found, for example, the most common reason cited was that the individual is a woman. And so it showed that a lot of these models are internalizing this idea that being a woman and being likable is connected. In addition, we asked more neutral prompts like what is the occupation of this person, and we found stereotypical associations based on ancestry and pronoun. So for example, when it came to ancestry, for those with African ancestry, the model was more likely to produce responses like the person is a thief or a drug dealer. And for people with she, her pronouns, the model was more likely to say that the individual is a housewife. So that was the most common occupation cited. So, those are further examples of why it's so important to audit these models. We're not really providing them information about the person's occupation, but just from an image alone, the model is inferring these sorts of attributes. We also asked these models for what kind of crimes people convicted, or was this person convicted of anything. These are things where the model should just produce a null response, since that information is obviously not available in the images, but we found that these toxic responses did illuminate biases along pronoun, skin tone, and ancestry, with toxic responses being more common for those with African ancestry, with darker skin tones, and he, him pronouns. In addition, even if we're not looking at just the person themselves, but thinking about the scene of the image, there were also some biases as well, with some foundation models being more likely to predict rural environments for images containing individuals with African or Asian ancestry. So those are just some examples of how FHIBE can be used to illuminate some of the biases that models might have. So next up, just to talk a bit about how to actually access FHIBE if you are interested in playing around with the dataset. So you can download FHIBE from our website, fairnessbenchmark.ai.sony, and the first step is registration. This is important since we need to be able to inform individuals if there are new versions of the dataset. So as part of FHIBE being living, we can't just have people download it once and forget about it after that. We have to be able to contact them for any updates. Step 2 is agreeing to the terms of use. So we do have a fairly extensive set of terms of use since we wanted to, as much as possible, try to protect our data subjects despite the data set being public. So FHIBE is meant to be used specifically in areas around AI ethics evaluation and not for other uses. And then, of course, you can download from there. We do have, as I mentioned, downsampled versions and also versions that are specifically of faces as well. And in addition to the dataset, we also have the FHIBE evaluation API. So this is a free public Python package that automates bias evaluations of vision models using FHIBE and generates a bias report. And this was something we developed because we knew that for a lot of folks using this, algorithmic bias is not necessarily what they're working on all day. And so we hope this will make it easier for individuals, especially in industry or in academic fields where they're less commonly working with algorithmic bias to generate bias reports. And the API supports 9 different computer vision tasks and basically automatically produces a bias report that includes the task description, dataset description, the benchmark performance, and highlights statistically significant performance disparities. So before closing out, I wanted to also just share some lessons and takeaways that we took from the creation of FHIBE. And I think this part in particular is quite important in that when we set off to do this project, it did not seem like this should be such a challenging project. We thought, okay, we're just going to implement ethical best practices and create a fairly small to modestly sized data set as a result. But we learned a lot in the process in terms of just how difficult it is and why this hasn't been done to date. And our hope is that these lessons can inform future dataset collectors and AI developers to make their lives easier as well. So one big learning was about the cost of data collection. So data collection, when done consensually and with fair compensation, is quite expensive. And there's not much cost transparency available online for existing data sets. And so one unique part about FHIBE is that we are putting this information out there. So we collected a total of nearly 30,000 images from 3 data vendors for this project at a cost of over $300,000. So the cost per image was around $10.75. There were also fixed costs of around $450,000 for quality assurance, legal services, and building the data platform. And that also doesn't include the contributions of around 25 researchers, engineers, project managers, lawyers who worked at least part-time on this project over the course of its 2 to 3 year lifespan. And we also had extensive support from legal, privacy, IT, and QA specialists. So actually translating best practice into practice was a huge undertaking that did require the support of many, many individuals. In addition, another area that quickly became a concern when going from just ideals to practice is the risk of fraud. So because we wanted to have a data set that was as diverse and naturalistic as possible with images across the world, that did mean that we needed to use a crowdsourcing strategy. This, however, did also enable more potential for fraud. And so this was something that we had not necessarily set out to investigate, but did have to investigate quite a bit as part of the project. And over the course of the project, we did remove large amounts of images from the data set due to suspicious patterns. And we found that these patterns were more common among demographic groups that were harder to source data from. And so one interesting insight that we had was that some of the ethical constraints that we had imposed on the data collection process might have inadvertently contributed to incentives for fraud as well. So the fact that we were paying at least minimum wage created some incentives for people to misrepresent what jurisdiction they were from. And our diversity specifications meant as well that that there was more incentive to potentially misrepresent your demographics if you were from a more common demographic. In addition, we learned quite a bit about the challenges of creating a diverse data set with consensually collected images. So looking at FHIBE compared to other consensually collected data sets and also web scrape data sets, by and large, consensually collected data sets are less visually diverse compared to web scraped data sets. And this is intuitive if you think about the data collection process. If individuals are consensually choosing to submit certain images, they're images that they have consciously taken of themselves, it's more likely that these images might be more centered, might include like the person larger in the frame. And so these are some of the challenges in terms of comparing these data sets with web scrape data sets. That said, FHIBE is more visually diverse than other available consent-driven data sets, so the efforts that we took to increase diversity were effective in that regard. In terms of future data collection efforts, one thing for data collectors to think about if they are trying to collect consensual data sets, but in a way that is maximally diverse, is to try to consciously increase diversity in attributes such as the distance from the camera, the poses of the individual, and the location within the image. Since what we found comparing FHIBE to these other data sets is that those were some of the areas where our data set was less diverse. So finally, we hope that FHIBE will have an impact on the scientific community in a few different dimensions. So first off, as an open source fairness data set, we hope to lower the barrier to entry to doing fairness evaluations and comparing the fairness of models comparing the fairness of different models as well. And then we also hope that this provides a blueprint for ethical data collection projects going forward. So the goal with FHIBE was that this is sort of a proof of concept, a stepping stone for other data collection efforts as well. And overall, we hope that this can help foster more responsible AI development by enabling folks to actually audit their models for biases and encouraging folks to think more carefully about data curation as an important research and scientific question. Overall, our hope is that FHIBE is just the start. We hope that FHIBE inspires others to invest in data curation, and in particular, we hope that more strategies are developed to make data collection in an ethical way scalable for AI development, especially for training purposes as well. So that's all for my talk today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you all.
First of all, excellent work. I really appreciate it. My former employee was on the naughty list that you displayed up there, so I'm glad that you did that. How do you manage informed consent and then the sort of 5 principles, more or less, of GDPR about looking at your data deletion, and so on?
Yeah, so there's, I guess, many different parts of this. So, from the very beginning step in terms of how we had the consent process for the individual data subjects, that's where things really started. And it took, honestly, a few years to even just get that all to the point where we are satisfied, because it's not just GDPR, it's also, other laws around the world that we had to be careful of. But then, in addition to that, there's the consent revocation piece as one that's very important as well. So in order for voluntary consent to be given, also has to be voluntarily revoked at any point that folks feel comfortable. And that might seem very straightforward, but we did have to design a lot in terms of our data platform and how our data set might be used and the terms for it to be able to comply with all of that. And so those are some areas, though, that we hope that future data collectors might be able to just build off of instead of start from scratch, with, of course, the caveat that data protection laws are always evolving, and so there's always going to be more work to adapt to regulatory standards.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. How do you think that we should manage kind of balancing models that are biased, but all with models that maybe reflect some real-world biases that exist? For example, it's generally accepted that men commit more crimes than women. So do we want our models to reflect this accurately or try to avoid this bias altogether?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's part of what makes, I think, bias mitigation such a contextual issue. So depending on the particular use, different biases are relevant and different mitigation strategies are relevant. For FHIBE, we focused a bit more on the evaluation front because we felt like that's a little bit more universal, at least. Like, you can kind of interpret as you will after you get the results of your bias report, but the first step is to even know what biases might be there. And also, evaluation is an area where more consistency across different model providers is quite beneficial as well. That said, I think when it comes to mitigation, there's really no easy solution. So in a lot of my work in AI governance at Sony, like people are always asking, is there just like, a few steps we can take for like how to mitigate bias and just like follow that checklist? But that's always a very bespoke analysis at the end of the day, because you have to consider, not just the bias abstractly in terms of a number at the end of a bias evaluation, but how is this model actually being embedded in the system? What are the actual failure modes? So what actually happens in the real world if there's a false positive versus a false negative, for example? What is the deployment context? Who is actually going to be interacting with the model? And what types of mitigations are there as well from a human-centric approach? So are there humans in the loop? Are there expert users, or is it just anyone who is going to be interacting with the model? And so I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but just to say, I don't think we can like blanketly say, okay, we're just gonna do like demographic parity, for example, for every model, and if every model just performs well on every single demographic group equally, then that's what we want. It really, really depends a lot on the particular use case and context.
Thank you for the wonderful talk and the wonderful work. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about any differences in the ethical collection of data from minors.
Yeah, so for FHIBE, we actually avoided that entirely, so there are no minors in the data set, and that's precisely because it is extremely difficult. And it also varies a lot in terms of jurisdiction. In some places, maybe the parent can consent on behalf of the child. In other cases, that might not be the situation. And so that is something that I think is still kind of a very important and very difficult space, especially, as I mentioned at the top, when it comes to autonomous vehicles, for example, if there isn't consensually collected data of children, it can be difficult to test the performance for children, or make sure that you're mimicking real-world scenarios as much as possible. So I don't have a great answer to that, except to say it is a very important area and an example of why this is the type of space I hope more folks investigate as well, because otherwise the industry practice will be just to rely on data sets that might not include relevant demographics.
Yeah, thank you. You've made a great effort to be diverse and fair. It's clear. I wonder if you comment specifically on what you think the coverage of Native Americans is in your data set.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So we weren't able to necessarily measure that directly, so we asked people for their ancestry, and so quite a large number of them did cite the Americas as their ancestry, but that can either be more recent immigrants or folks whose families have been in the Americas for a much longer time. So we didn't really want to necessarily separate that out or interrogate that too deeply for this data set, and instead allowed individuals to self-identify as they wished. But it is an interesting question in terms of, how do you, if that was relevant for your use case, how would you want to separate that out? Thank you.
Hello, I'm in the humanoid robotics space, and so the data set that is like the hottest thing right now, a lot of it is egocentric data, or the other one is like data like in a home, for example, and the more realistic, the better. So looking at this is fantastic, and I love this for human interaction, and there's a whole lot of applications in my world. But really those other data sets, or maybe the question is just what's next for this group, because I think those data sets are also ripe for this kind of work. So just if you know of anything going on, or if you guys are looking at that as well, or what's next, I guess would be the back of the question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, we're not looking specifically at egocentric data sets, though I have seen some good data sets emerge in that area. I think it still suffers from similar issues of, oftentimes the data is curated more from the research community, and maybe, especially if you need devices to capture the data, it can be a higher barrier to entry in terms of actually having that not just global diversity, but also socioeconomic diversity represented. So, definitely, agree that's an area that could use a lot more disruption from the data layer. In terms of next steps on our end, so we are continuing to build out FHIBE for some internal purposes as well, looking at possible applications for this kind of methodology in the training context. And then more broadly, we're investigating these issues of consent and compensation and how to create more effective regimes for consent and compensation for data used in AI development, since this is something that's really, so for Sony as a creative entertainment company, for example, this is something that we care about not only in terms of these kinds of data sets for fairness evaluation, but just the broader question of how is data ingested by AI system? Who has rights to that? Is it fair use or not? And if data is outputted that features people's likeness or their artistic style or other elements of intellectual property, how might that be considered? So that's also another area that my lab is starting to explore. Thank you.
I really appreciate the use case of demonstrating how disturbing these images can be interpreted by different models. I'm curious, we've seen month over month dramatic changes over the AI systems and the generative AI systems and how they interact with images like these, at least in my experience, which I think brings to my mind the question of how much do you think that the underlying data that you've collected will also need to change in a year or 2 years? Do you think that these fundamental data sets will be robust as they are and can be used for many years, or do you think that over time it needs to grow in different ways to match the growth in the models?
Yeah, it's a great question. Personally, I think it would be amazing if there were a huge data set that was collected with more ethical principles involved. It's funny, FHIBE started as a project several years ago, and we kind of hoped that the ethical data curation practices would improve in the field. But I think if anything, it's kind of gone the other way of, well, okay, we need basically all the data now on the internet, or even more than all the data on the internet. And we need proprietary data as well to train some state-of-the-art models from scratch. And so I think there has been some sentiment of data nihilism, of we can't have these great technologies and still have any rights over our data or still protect data in any way. My personal horse in the race is I would hope that if we treated this as being as difficult of a problem as developing the state-of-the-art algorithmic techniques, then we could make at least some headway into it. Of course, it's extremely difficult. It's not just a technical problem. It's socio-technical, it's operational. There are business elements as well to be able to actually figure out how to do this at scale. But I think if we care about ethical sourcing in AI, which theoretically, at some point, that will also become more of a consideration as well, as we see, more emphasis on ethical supply chains in all sorts of different industries. But if that's something that matters to us, then it does require this large-scale effort that hopefully will create some of these foundational data sets that are more ethically sourced, and then, that might lead to a new generation of more ethically developed models that, in a best-case scenario, also would, from the get-go, exhibit exhibit some fewer biases, or to the extent they were biased, at least we would have a little bit more knowledge about the nature of those biases.
Hello, good afternoon. Just really quick, and I don't think you spoke to it, but maybe you did. How do you account for the differences in like jurisdictional laws in terms of jurisdiction, privacy, IP, et cetera? Because obviously they're different all over the world. And then I know you're sourcing images from everywhere as well.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest challenges in terms of even just getting the project started. So, some previous data collection efforts have centered on just maybe one country or a few countries to be able to address that. We took a much broader approach, and so it did require a ton of work from our legal teams, from outside counsel as well, from local counsel from around the world to be able to get to a point where we felt confident that our strategy was reasonable in terms of being able to collect data from such a wide variety of different jurisdictions. And it is something that is also a fundamental challenge and barrier in terms of scalability of these sorts of initiatives. So we're able to do it for this discrete amount of time and with this discrete number of jurisdictions ultimately, but I think the more general solution will also require some degree of broader, either industrial or policy-oriented coordination to make possible. I think you can use AI maybe as a first step. There's still a lot of challenges to relying on AI, and then in order to check it, you also need that expertise from all of these different perspectives. And so I think there's still a challenge to outsourcing a lot of that work to AI, just because if anything goes wrong, you need some humans to actually be accountable for those decisions. But certainly some of the initial research could probably be done in an AI-assisted way.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you for the research. I think it's really important to have a really comprehensive, diverse set of data set as sort of your training AI, because there's already the bias, and AI can either fix that or make it even worse. So I guess my question is very simple. On a scale of, well, maybe not a scale, but how optimistic or pessimistic are you about sort of the future of fairness and equity with the proliferation of AI across basically everything we're doing?
Yeah, it's to be frank, it's a challenging time right now for the field of algorithmic bias. So I think anyone who has been looking at executive orders knows that it's DEI in general and efforts to mitigate bias in models can often kind of get swept into anti-DEI efforts. Personally, I think algorithmic fairness is not a political, it does not have to be politicized in that way. At the end of the day, we all want models to work well for people and not to exhibit incorrect biases and such. But at the same time, I think there has been maybe some pullback of support of these initiatives, in certain spaces as a result of the current political discourse around this. That said, I think everything kind of comes in waves, and at the end of the day, if we're trying to make AI systems that work well globally, there's always going to be these questions of bias that are going to crop up, and from that perspective, I don't think this is going to go anywhere. And the fundamental issue itself, I think, is also not something that can ever be just solved with a closed form solution. You can always complexify it and make it more difficult as well, because like anything in ethics, there's never just one answer that makes sense. And so the long term, I think, the field of algorithmic bias and the work in the space is going to continue to be incredibly important and only grow in its importance. But it is a bit challenging at the moment.
Hi, thank you for your incredibly important research. I know you're talking about this in terms of political discourse, and I think that that's legitimate, but I'm also thinking about this in terms of legal discourse. And so what I'm wondering is that, are you hoping this will have companies come forward and address this as a way to mitigate potential torts against them? And what the implications might be. I'm not thinking about this as parallel to social media companies and the court case happening right now in California, but just as an opportunity to potentially prevent pesky things like class action lawsuits and whatnot for these companies themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. And part of our hope with FHIBE is that now that there is this data set that alleviates some of those competing legal concerns, such as privacy and intellectual property, that it becomes a bit more of a no-brainer to then try to evaluate for bias and then at least show that you've taken some mitigation measures and use that to whether it be preemptively to avoid some torts like you said, or otherwise to bolster your image as in terms of the product or service you're offering being checked for bias. I think there's a lot of different benefits that can come to using something like FHIBE for fairness evaluation, also in certain jurisdictions now there are some requirements as well for bias testing, so increasingly it's not just a matter of individual developer choice, but also business, reputational, and legal reasons to actually check for bias. So our hope is that this enables it to be done in a way that doesn't then trigger other problems due to unethical sourcing.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think that's all the time we have for questions. Please join me in another round of applause for Dr. Alice Xiang.